I respectfully acknowledge that we are here on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We offer our gratitude to the Indigenous peoples for their care and teachings about the earth and our relations. May we honor them and the land we live on.
This year, number 80 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action has been fulfilled, naming September 30th the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This is a day of remembrance and reflection on the legacy of the residential school system and the intergenerational harm that has been caused. This is also a day to honor survivors, as well as the children who did not make it home.
It is a day to look into offering reparations, like donating to Indigenous organizations and supporting the Indigenous peoples in our lives. A day to attend Indigenous-led events that garner support and raise awareness. It is vital to listen to Indigenous peoples on this day, and as non-Indigenous people, we have the responsibility to make sure their voices are heard and not talked over. I encourage us to have conversations with our friends and family about what truth and reconciliation means, and to be grateful for the Indigenous caretakers of this beautiful land we now occupy. This day isn't supposed to be a day off. It's a time of education, reflection, and appreciating Indigenous cultures. Having a day named and devoted to truth and reconciliation is a great start, but what's the next step?
In June 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published the 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and to advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. The CTA covers a range of topics, the 6 main ones being child welfare, education, health, justice, language, and culture. As of today, only 14 of the 94 calls to action have been completed. I urge everyone to read through each of the 94 calls to action to understand how much work still needs to be done and to get ideas of what you can do to help. A CTA that spoke to me and that is crucial is number 62, make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal people's historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory requirement for K-12 students.
We need to acknowledge the long-lasting impact residential schools had and still have on Indigenous peoples to this day. But first, we need to recognize the role that Canada's government played in these atrocities of the past. Misinformation needs to be curbed through thoughtful collaboration with Indigenous peoples and hearing their stories with an open heart.
Reconciliation to me means fully accepting the atrocities of the past and taking action to work towards a more equitable future. I think a big part of reconciliation is this concept of decolonization. I think decolonizing our minds is a process, it's a continued process that we should all engage in. But I'm sure that a lot of us are not familiar with what it is. And so I think listening to, supporting Indigenous voices is very important. I think as settlers, our role in reconciliation is to amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples, it's to learn Indigenous history and current systemic issues, and call out bigotry and ignorance when we hear it.
Lastly, we believe that more efforts could be made to infuse Indigenous knowledge and teachings into all of our classes. For example, TEK, or Traditional Ecological Knowledge, could easily be included into a life sciences course. These efforts that seem small could make a huge difference long term.
There are many different ways you can support Indigenous people and their communities. You can amplify Indigenous voices and listen to Indigenous stories and their experiences. Acknowledge whose land you are on as we work, live, and play on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the stolen land. You can support land defenders and join Indigenous protests such as Land Back, Every Child Matters, and Missing Murdered Indigenous Women. And by decolonizing our mindsets and languages, such as to stop whitewashing and westernizing history derived from colonialism, and to stop using words to describe Indigenous people as savage or Indian. And unlearning the Western model of education and infusing multiple worldviews, and as previously mentioned, having Indigenous speakers in classrooms. Lastly, you can donate to organizations such as the IRSSS and other organizations that help Indigenous communities.